Well, hello, brothers and sisters. I am just so delighted to see you here today. Really, it touches my heart. I tell you, it touches my heart. And there was one sentence that I read to you on Tuesday, our last meeting together, that has just reverberated with me yesterday and even today. And that sentence was, and it was from Murder Incorporated by Mamiya Abu Jamal and Stephen Victoria. It went like this: when the Europeans came to America, they killed with a fury that would make the Nazis blush. I think I'm going to use that in many different kinds of ways because that got to me. They slew, massacred, raped, burned, and tortured. Now, this is key, and let me tell you why. You see, the Africans and Native Americans, they did war within their own communities, okay? Over here in the Americas, the Native Americans, the different ethnic red nations would go to war with other red nation ethnic groups. But war was never so awful, was never so, you didn't kill babies. It was the Europeans that did that. And the Africans, same. They warred with one another within the African continent. But very often, if anybody got killed, it was maybe one person. And they too were not used to their babies being slaughtered. They weren't used to their crops being burned. So food, starvation was used as a weapon of war by the Europeans. So, I mean, that information, it sticks with me all the time. And it's one of the reasons why I even created this series, because it is important for us, as John Henry Clark has said. Malcolm even said it too. We got to know where we've been so that we could plan for where we are going. All right. So today, I want to talk about how the Native American was de-Indianized, if you will, and how the African was de-Africanized. All right. And I am reading again from Murder Incorporated. I'm on page 138, but do know this. I do skip around in my book. Okay. I'm quoting from David Stannard, a historian. And he says, we may see the projection of Africans as an artifact of the European world, of division, categorization, and differentiation. For in Africa, called by many names throughout human time, when all are Africans, who is not? Akan, Pio, Fulani, Ashanti, Mandingo, Mandinke, Zulu, or the like. Stannard expands on that view, illustrating how this form of cultural blindness spelled doom for the vast millions of people held under this ethnic umbrella. Stannard says, a list of distinctions marking the uniqueness of one or another group that has suffered from genocidal mass destruction or near or total extermination could go on at length. Additional problems emerge because of a looseness in the terminology commonly used to describe categories and communities of genocidal victims. A traditional Eurocentric bias that lumps undifferentiated masses of Africans into one single category and undifferentiated masses of Indians into another, while making the fine distinctions among the different populations of Europe, permits the ignoring of cases in which genocide against Africans and American Indians has resulted in the total exterminations purposefully carried out of entire cultural, social, religious, and ethnic groups. This worldview opened up the possibilities of the vast genocides that made America possible. Let me say this again. This worldview opened up the possibilities of the vast genocides that made America possible, for it eased the way for the toxin of racism to take root, which in turn justified the unnamed, unmentioned Holocaust of which we speak. For what does it matter what happens to niggers or redskins? They're just Indians, and as we all know, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and it did not take long for Indian to become African. As Europeans sought to de-Indianize Indians, they similarly sought to de-Africanize Africans by outlawing African languages. By outlawing African languages, I mean, what am I speaking to you now? I'm speaking in English. Outlawing African languages, drafting laws to make drums illegal. Do you understand that Africans could talk with drums? A neighboring African could beat his or her drum in a certain way, and another group of Africans listening knew what that other group was saying by way of the drums. So therefore, in America, drums were forbidden, illegal. So then that means that you could go to jail if you beat the drum, or be slapped or whipped if you beat the drum in early America when enslavement started. Okay? Then they forcibly changed names of African people. Mandingo was no longer in Mandingo. Zulu was no longer Zulu. Igbo no longer Igbo. And that which could be thought of as Africanic was forbidden, criminalized, demonized in public consciousness, and then in social practice. Africa became the psychosocial repository for all that was deemed negative. A kind of American alter ego hidden in its repressed nation self. And by so doing, it gave a perverted sense of inflated value to whiteness that it did not heretofore possess. It gave life to this psychosis, energizing it into a core constituent of the American personality. Now I'm going to switch gears because I want to talk about another American doctrine that you've heard. You've heard politicians use this term over the years, but you may not have actually knew where it came from and its significance. All right. And when I talk about this term with you, the Monroe Doctrine, I do want you to think about your world today. In fact, whenever I read you a historical point, I want you to take that historical point and see if you can fit it within the confines of our nation and how you feel about it today. That's very important. The Monroe Doctrine. This is on page 195 of Murder Incorporated. The devil is right at home. The devil himself is right in the house. And the devil came here yesterday. Yesterday, the devil came here, right here, and it smells of sulfur still today. Now, that was Hugo Chavez holding up a copy of Noam Chomsky's Hegemony or Survival, addresses the UN General Assembly, New York City, October 20th, 2006. One day after Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress and famously defined December the 7th, 1941, as a date which will live in infamy. In fact, there are many dates which will live in infamy. And one of those dates is December the 2nd, 1823. December the 2nd, 1823, when another American president, James Monroe, also addressed a joint session of Congress. It was Monroe's 7th annual State of the Union address, and the words he spoke that day not only cemented the foundation of the American empire, but also unleashed the modus operandi of United States foreign policy that rages hard to this day. With history as our witness, the Monroe Doctrine codified the forceful expansion of the empire, and later through its official corollary, disgorged by Big Stick Teddy Roosevelt, the United States would assume the exercise of the international police power. The United States would assume the exercise of an international police power. And that continues right to this day. The doctrine was primarily composed by the then Secretary of State and future United States President, John Quincy Adams, along with cabinet members John C. Calhoun and William Wirt. In his book, Imperial America, Gore Vidal sardonically defines the all-purpose Monroe Doctrine as the invention of John Quincy Adams, an imperial tool that has functioned and evolved for almost 200 years as a declaration of hegemony, as well as a trigger for unilateral intervention throughout the Americas, and by extension, the world. Initially, the primary objective of the Monroe Doctrine was to ensure and solidify an American sphere of influence over the Western Hemisphere, as Latin American colonies were breaking the stranglehold of Spanish and Portuguese colonial occupation. For the United States government, it was the moment in time to draw a hard line in the sand between the anticipated interference throughout the Americas by Old World European empires versus Washington's own designs on New World dominance. Okay. I want to read this last piece here. As we will detail, American presidents and policymakers have used the foundation and basic tenets of the Monroe Doctrine, as well as the general braggadocio, to justify almost every act of United States aggression across the planet, from James K. Polk's belligerent reassertion of the doctrine to validate his war against and massive land theft of Mexico, 1846, to George W. Bush's perverse precept regarding preemptive attack used to rationalize America's so-called war on terror and the subsequent murder spree in the Middle East. Now, those of you who are watching this with your children, as I hope that you are, talk more about the Monroe Doctrine. Give it your personal historical stamp, because the Monroe Doctrine, with America as the global international policeman, has been used since the 19th century, and this is now the 21st century. And it is even being used right now in a way that I'm not going to mention, but you should figure that out. America has become an international, global policeman. It's in their law. It's in their doctrines. It's in their refurbishing manifest destiny, where the United States leaders believe that God is with them when they go to war with other countries that may not have all the weapons that the United States has. So I want you to think about these things. I want you to think about the Korean War. What was that about? What was World War One really about? World War Two really about? Okay? And just like the book mentioned, Iraq. What was that really for? And listen, whenever I say war, I want you to think about the hundreds of thousands or millions of civilians that are killed. Wars are supposed to be between the soldiers. Forget that. Forget that. Forget that. The Americans, the Europeans have slaughtered whoever was in their way, be it man, woman, child, elderly, disabled. It does not matter, because these people believe in manifest destiny. And if you're a little unsure of what that means, again, go back over some of my previous videos where I go at length to explain manifest destiny, because it is happening right now. And I really want my listeners to figure that out. Okay. Well, I can't leave you without reading Brother Fred. Because, see, Brother Fred actually tells us all what it was like to be enslaved. Again, this book was written in 1845, and I'm going to pick up where I left off on Tuesday, where he's talking about his home plantation. Fred Douglass says, the home plantation of Colonel Lloyd wore the appearance of a country village. Now, Colonel Lloyd, he had a lot of plantations, maybe 300 to 500 enslaved Africans on his plantations. And understand, when I say enslaved Africans, I'm talking about our ancestors who have worked for free. All the mechanical operations for all the farms were performed here: the shoemaking and mending, the blacksmithing, cart riding, coopering, weaving, and grain grinding were all performed by the slaves on the home plantation. The whole place wore a business-like aspect, very unlike the neighboring farms. The number of houses, too, conspired to give it advantage over the neighboring farms. It was called by the slaves the Great House Farm. Few privileges were esteemed higher by the slaves of the out farms than that of being selected to do errands at the Great House Farm. It was associated in their minds with greatness. A representative could not be prouder of his election to a seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of the out farms would be of his election to do errands at the Great House Farm. They regarded it as evidence of great confidence reposed in them by their overseers. And it was on this account, as well as a constant desire to be out of the field from under the driver's lash, that they esteemed it a high privilege, one worth careful living for. He was called the smartest and most trusty fellow who had this honor conferred upon him the most frequently. The competitors for this office sought as diligently to please their overseers as the office seekers in the political parties seek to please and deceive the people. The same traits of character might be seen in Colonel Lloyd's slaves as are seen in the slaves of the political parties. The slaves selected to go to the Great House Farm for the monthly allowance for themselves and their fellow slaves were peculiarly enthusiastic. While on their way, they would make the dense old woods for miles around reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joy and the deepest sadness. They would compose and sing as they went along, consulting neither time nor tune. The thought that came up came out, if not in the word, in the sound, and as frequently in the one as in the other. They would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiment in the most rapturous tone, and the most rapturous sentiment in the most pathetic tone. Into all of their songs, they would manage to weave something of the Great House Farm. Especially would they do this when leaving home. They would then sing most exultingly the following words: I am going away to the Great House Farm. Oh, yay, oh, yay, oh, yay. I'm sure they sang it better than I just did, but I did my best. This they would sing as a chorus to words which to many would seem unmeaning jargon, but which nevertheless were full of meaning to themselves. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meaning of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so that I neither saw nor heard as those without might see and hear. They told a tale of woe, which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Each tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. The hearing of those wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. I have frequently found myself in tears while hearing them. The mere recurrence to those songs, even now, afflicts me. And while I am writing these lines, an expression of feeling has already found its way down my cheek. To those songs, I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. I can never get rid of that conception. Those songs will follow me to deepen my hatred of slavery and quicken my sympathies for my brethren in bonds. If anyone wishes to be impressed with the soul killing effects of slavery, let him go to Colonel Lloyd's plantation and on allowance day, place himself in the deep pine woods, and there let him in silence analyze the sounds that shall pass through the chambers of his soul. And if he is not thus impressed, it will only be because there is no flesh in his obdurate heart. And people, notice how much songs mean even to us today. I mean, a song can say so much about the human condition. A song is a release. This is why we listen to music. And this is why, especially those of us who are not really singers, we will sing when nobody's really listening. It is a release of either joy, but in this case, sadness. And notice that these enslaved Africans, African American people, Black people, they would make up their own songs and they would sing in the woods. And they would do that because they were absolutely thrilled to be away from the field and the driver's lash. Now I'm going to read from another book, just a short piece that I wanted you to know about. And the book is called The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. And it's by Edward Baptiste. And I wanted you to know about this book. I'm trying to remove some things that I'm having a problem with. I'm trying to remove the book. Okay, here we go. Well, I haven't removed the book. Okay, let me try this. Okay, that hasn't worked. Okay, very good. Oh, God. In any event, this is key because the making of America depended a lot on the foundation of Black bondage. This is what I want you to understand. And this is quite a book. Now, this chapter, I read some of it on Tuesday. I'm going to read a little more now. Edward Baptiste, the author, he names this chapter Feet. And in the previous session that I had with you, you may remember that a girl working in the field, she sees a coffle. A coffle of slaves is slaves being chained from the shoulders, a whole bunch of them all chained together, and they gotta walk. And there's the enslaver on a horse guiding them along. And the last portion that I read to you on Tuesday, this girl who was working in the field looked up at the lead Black man that was leading the people who were chained, right, on the coffle, and she recognized her father. And again, this chapter is called Feet. I'm only going to read a little, but I thought it was important for you to hear this. There are 1,760 yards in a mile, more than 2,000 steps. 40,000 is a long day's journey. 200,000 is a hard week. For 80 years, from the 1780s until 1865, enslaved Africans walked for miles, days, and weeks. Driven south and west over flatlands and mountains, step after step, they were further from home, stumbling with fatigue, staggering with whiskey, even sometimes stepping high on bright spring mornings when they refused to think of what weighted them down. Many covered over 700 miles before stepping off the road their footsteps made. 700 miles is 1.5 million steps. After weeks of wading rivers, crossing state lines, and climbing mountain roads, and even boarding boats and ships, and then disembarking, they had moved their bodies across the frontier between the old slavery and into the new slavery. Over the course of 80 years, almost 1 million people were herded down the road into the new slavery. This chapter is about how these forced marchers began as they walked those roads to change things about the eastern and western United States. Like shifting grains moved from one side of a balance to another. It shows how the first forced migrations began to tramp down paths along which another 1 million walkers, 1.5 trillion steps would shape 7 decades of slavery's expansion in the new United States. And it shows how the paths they made on the land, in politics, and in the economy, the footsteps that driven slaves and those who drove them left on the fundamental documents and bargains of the nation, kept the nation united and growing. For at the end of the American Revolution, the victorious leaders of the newly independent nations were not sure that they could hold their precarious conditions or coalition of states together. The United States claimed vast territories west of the Appalachian Mountains, but these lands were a source of vulnerability. Other nations claimed them. Native Americans refused to vacate them. Western settlers contemplated breaking loose to form their own coalitions. East of the Appalachians, internal divisions threatened to tear apart the new country. The American Revolution had been financed by printing paper money and bonds, but that had produced inflation, indebtedness, and low commodity prices, which now in the 1780s were generating a massive economic crisis. There was no stable currency. The federal government, such as it was, had no ability to tax, and so it also could not act as a national state. Between the arrival of the first Africans in 1619 and the outbreak of revolution in 1775, slavery had been one of the engines of colonial economic growth. I'm going to say that again. Slavery had been one of the engines of colonial economic growth. So, brothers and sisters, I want you to remember how important you were to the growth and development of what we now call America. And I'm going to encourage you again to use this series as a Saturday school for not only you, but for your children, for your cousins, for your friends, and even those you don't like that much. Okay? You want our people to know the true history of how we got here, what it was like to be here for over 300 years, working for free. We need to know that information. All right? So, my name is Regina, and you have been watching Readings with Regina, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 2:00. Okay? And in the meantime, know that you are prayed for by me every night and every morning. And know that I absolutely love you very, very deeply. So while we are away from each other, I want you to take good care of yourself and those that you love. Peace and blessings.